Oh, you're too kind. You're too kind. No. Congratulations on those of you in this engineering education PhD program. Just how many of you are in this new program? Okay. So the topic, I'm just kind of curious. So you saw the title. How many of you are thinking about exploring an entrepreneurial career path? Just show of hands. Maybe, kind of. Okay. Yeah. See some maybes. That's to be expected. That's exactly what I would expect. And I was in your shoes, 20, 25 years ago, and so I kind of wanted to share a little bit of my story because the topic I wanted to share was how a PhD program is really not only a fantastic gateway to innovation and entrepreneurship, but more and more so, it's really it's becoming the sort of the de facto part of a PhD that will help prepare you no matter what you end up doing. Okay, so there we go. Nope, that did not work. Sorry, clicked the wrong button. This thing has like 6 buttons. I've never seen a clicker that's so advanced. I think I can order lunch and do all kinds of things with it. You might have seen my bio. If you didn't, it's not a big deal, but I just wanted to share a little bit about me that's not so boring and professional. I've lived some on the East Coast, lived some on the West Coast, and a bunch of places elsewhere. I love doing RV road trips with my family. We just spent the week at the beach. I'm really into basketball. I didn't put Frisbee up there, but I should have added Frisbee. I'm going to try to play tomorrow evening. But I love playing, coaching, watching basketball. I really love what I'm doing, which I think we all are kind of share some element of this passion of helping students learn, get excited, get prepared for their careers, and make an impact on the world. So I mentioned the title because I wanted to share a little bit about what it was like back in 1989 when I was in your shoes. I was a PhD candidate myself. Part of the reason I was in a PhD program was because I didn't know what I wanted to do, actually, so it was a good way of deferring reality in the real world. And back then, entrepreneurship really was kind of an alternative career path. Just to give you a sense of where I was, I would have not had my hand up at all if anybody asked me about being interested in entrepreneurship. My mom worked for Immigration and Naturalization, which is now CIS. My dad worked for the DOD, so only child of 2 career federal bureaucrats, 2 of the least entrepreneurial organizations in our country. And then I went to MIT because my parents wanted me to go there. That was like their lifelong dream, to have their child go to MIT. And I wanted to stay for grad school. And I got rejected for grad school. All my friends were staying for grad school. My girlfriend was going to stay there. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I didn't get in. But fortunately, I got accepted to Stanford, and that completely changed my life. Completely changed my life from not even being aware that what entrepreneurship was, what it could do, what it means, anything related to that, to now I am like spreading the entrepreneurship gospel everywhere. So 20 years ago, some of you may recognize, I know there are a couple colleagues that I'm meeting with today that spent some time in some of these buildings and even had same advisor as me, but that's Mark Kokoski up there on the upper right. He was my advisor during my PhD program. I was in a robotics lab, and we specialized in this flavor of robotics called Haptics, simulating the sense of touch. And if you'll indulge me for just like a couple minutes, I want to just say a little bit about what we were doing. And those of you like Micah and Icor will laugh because you're not supposed to talk about your technology. But anyway, so this is this is sort of what we were exploring. This was the research area that we want to we want to investigate the sense of touch, but because in the real world, it's something we rely on every day, consciously, if not subconsciously. Any musicians who play guitar or piano out there? A few of you, right? Imagine trying to play guitar or piano without feeling the frets or without feeling the keys, where you actually have to look to see are my fingers in the right place or on the right keys. It's just an entirely different experience. If you try finding your pulse, I mean, there's no other good way of detecting your pulse except through your sense of touch. For you people who've played golf or tennis or baseball, you know that great feeling when you hit the sweet spot of like your golf club or the tennis racket or the baseball bat, as opposed to when you shank it off the heel or club, which is what I more likely do. But you know right away when you hit it, without even looking to see where the ball went, you can actually have a pretty good sense of where it went and what direction based on sense of feel, right? That's all haptics, the sense of touch and the information we get from it. Touch is in our everyday vernacular, touch tone phones, touch typing. So I'm guessing somebody out there knows what's going on in these pictures on the right. Anybody know? Anybody heard of Tadoma or have a guess as to what's going on in those illustrations on the right? So, yeah. So this guy here in the flowered shirt, his name is Leonard Dowdy. And he is both deaf and blind. And so, anybody have a guess what's going on then? I see some nodding. Yeah, nodding. What do you think's going on?
Maybe trying to read their faces.
Yeah, exactly. Not only read their faces, communicate. So Tadoma is a method of communication where by placing your hands across the face of whoever's speaking with your fingers splayed across the cheeks, the lips, the chin, and feeling the throat and the vibrations, Leonard can actually tell what people were saying. He can understand what they were saying. And just to give you a sense of how amazing Leonard is at this, there's a professor also in the field of haptics. Her name's Hong Tan. She's at Purdue. For you Purdue people out there may know her. Yeah, you met her?
I had her as a professor.
Oh, awesome. So she met Leonard. And when she met Leonard, so he had his hands on her face, and she said, "Hi, Leonard, how are you?" And he said he was able to tell that because of her accent that she was Chinese. It was pretty amazing. So it just gives you a sense. I mean, of course, that's years and years of practice. But the main point is we get such rich and fine information from our sense of touch that you can't necessarily get from other senses. And so that was our goal for this company. There's a fellow in my lab named Louis Rosenberg. He's a primary founder of this company. He said, we get this world of information, and we have this world of information that we interact with every day, but then we go to computers and we work with things like this Windows calculator that are so frustrating. All you get is visual feedback. I'm sure we've all done this, not using the keypad on your keyboard if you have the number pad, but actually using the mouse and trying to position the cursor over a button and click and see did it actually register. It's very frustrating. So he had this idea that we could make something like the Windows calculator feel just like a touch-tone phone with this robotics and haptics technology. If you look at the two tasks, they're almost identical. You've got rows and columns of buttons about the same size, and your goal is to hit a sequence of them as quickly and with as few mistakes as possible. And while the Windows calculator is excruciatingly difficult and painstaking, this you can almost do with your eyes closed. And it's because here you can feel the corners and edges of the button. You can get that satisfying click sensation when it actually depresses. And so if anybody has a Samsung touchscreen phone, you get that same sensation now when you press buttons. In fact, that's licensed technology from Immersion, which is kind of giving away the end story. But anyway, so 20 years ago, we didn't have the technology that fit in the phone yet. We made something ridiculous, and here it is pictured. We did what all the startup experts like Steve Blank and Lean Startup tell you not to do, which is spend lots of money and lots of time building what you think is fantastic, only to discover nobody will buy it. That's exactly what we did. This thing we tried to sell for $200,000, but I'll try to explain why we went ahead and built this, because looking back on it now, we're like, of course nobody was going to buy this. But so that's Jim Kramer. He was an early employee at Immersion. He's wearing the precursor to the Oculus goggles. Those are VR goggles that existed back then. And those are two robot arms that are connected to the back of his gloves. And when he looked around, he was, in this particular application, he was sitting inside a car cockpit. It was meant for Ford or BMW, others for designing car cockpits, but rather than spending the $500,000 or $1 million to actually build a prototype of it's called the seating buck, and then discover, I can't reach the windshield wiper stock very conveniently, and having to make another one, they could design it in CAD and then go sit in it and experience it and feel it and interact with it virtually. So that was the idea. And the way it worked was if Jim turned his head to the right, he would see the passenger seat and window. If he turned it to the left, he would see the door, although some of it's not shown right there. And the robot arms, as he moved his hands around in front of him in free space, he would see his virtual hands interacting with the dashboard. So he could actually reach his arms out and start to lower his hands towards that virtual dashboard. So there's nothing really there. But the instant his hand would touch the dashboard, the robot would start to turn on and pull up on his hand, on the glove attached to his hand. So he would start to feel like, oh, I can start to rest the weight of my hands on the dashboard. And he could even completely relax his arms so they would go limp, and the full weight of his arms would be held suspended, and the robot would be pulling it up. And since he's looking at his hand on this virtual dashboard, it gives him the illusion that, wow, there's really a solid dashboard there. And there's a close-up of the hand here. To the back of each finger were these cables, and they work just like bicycle brakes. So normally, the cables there had slack in them, and each one is connected to a motor. And if we put like a virtual coffee mug on the dashboard, he could reach his hand out. He would see his fingers start to close around the mug. And the instant his fingers actually contacted that virtual mug, the motors would take up all the slack in the cables, and then suddenly he couldn't move any further. And so in his mind, it would make him feel like, wow, there's a solid coffee cup in my fingers. Now, he didn't feel the smooth texture and the cool temperature of a ceramic mug, but when you're looking in the goggles and you see the mug and it feels like it's there, it's enough to kind of fool your brain into this, you're actually interacting with this virtual environment. So that's why we built it, because we thought this is the coolest thing in the world. When we tried it, we thought it was fantastic. We brought our friends and our family to try it, like, whoa, this is amazing. But we really never thought about the business side of things, of who can afford a $200,000 product. And even if they could, you have to be seated in this giant monstrosity thing like this. Like, nobody would want to be seen in public with this. So we had a first tough lesson in media, sort of what value are delivering to who. And so we were a little bit smarter in our second iteration. We still were not savvy enough to actually go out and understand what the market's needs and problems actually were, but we thought, let's make something that's cheaper. We'll put it in the form of a joystick, and this thing's only $5,000, so a lot more people should be able to afford this. And this gives you a sense of my programming skills and why I didn't go into computer science, but I did the graphics for this. But the yellow thing is a ball, and the green thing is just a paddle. And with the joystick, you could bounce the ball up and down. And what was cool is we had a real physics simulation going on where you could change the properties. You could change gravity. You could change the stretchiness of the paddle. But basically, you could do different things like imagine an 8-ball or the cue ball from a pool table. You can imagine that if you've probably done this before. If you were to throw that ball up and then hold your hand rigidly and just let it come down and slap your hand, it makes a distinct sound. You can even imagine what the impact would feel like, right? Or you could throw it up, and as it's coming down, you time it so that just as it's coming down, you catch it and decelerate it and cradle it. So there's no sound. You barely feel it at all, right? But you can feel the weight decelerating. So you could do that, and with the joystick, you could actually feel like, okay, I'm going to cradle it now, I'm going to sling it up, I'm going to change gravity. And so this, again, was a fun thing to do that a lot of people will come and play with it and say it's really fun, but we didn't sell very many of them. But we actually this is another thing I wanted to mention, is that our first board member was this guy named Steve Blank. He's sort of one of the fathers of Lean Startup. And he arranged a demo with Steve Jobs for us. So we actually took our bouncing ball demo, and as well as a mouse, we put the technology in a mouse with the Windows calculator demo, and we got to go demonstrate this technology to Steve Jobs in his office at Apple. It was just Steve Jobs, his senior VP of hardware, John Rubinstein, who has the nickname the Podfather. He was the guy who kind of led their efforts to launch the iPod product. And then Louis, the primary founder, CEO, and me. It was just pretty intimidating experience. And he was trying all this stuff out, and because we were pitching it that this could be the next generation operating system that you interact with touch. And and this is back in 1997, and he completely poo-pooed it. He's like, people hate mice right now. Like in 2 years or 3 years, everything's going to be voice recognition everywhere, and they're not going to be mice anywhere. And so he was totally bashing the technology. And looking back on it, I mean, anybody probably this may have jumped out to you as already. We showed up in his office showing a demonstration running on a DOS machine. It wasn't even a Mac. And so looking back, we were probably doomed from failure from the outset, even if he liked it, he wouldn't have said anything. But he did say one thing at the end. He's like, I could see how this would be cool for video games. And he wasn't the only one that said that. We had heard that from several other people, and we kind of like video games ourselves, and we said, okay, well, maybe we should focus on a particular market. So we went to the Computer Game Developer Conference. This is in 1995. If you can't read it, Santa Clara Convention Center, Silicon Valley, California. We brought our bouncing ball demo, and we were very fortuitous that, so this was a show where all the people who make video games, the artists, the programmers for all the major game companies come to the show, and there was a guy at the show who came by our table and started playing with this bouncing ball, and he was just playing with it. He was just like chuckling to himself. And then he left, and then a few minutes later he came back, but he had a bunch of people with them, and they were all playing with it. And so we started talking to him, and it turned out, lucky for us, that he was one of the 3 main programmers on the Need for Speed team at EA. So this is like the best-selling racing game franchise in EA's history. There was a terrible movie last summer or 2 summers based on this that came out that was based on this game. And Chuck Walters said, hey, this technology is pretty cool. Can you put this in a steering wheel? And so, as engineers, you guys might appreciate this. So, we're very sort of technology snobby kinds of engineers. So like a steering wheel, that's 1 degree of freedom. We can build 6 degree of freedom robots. Why in the world would you want something so simple? That's child's play. Like, we don't want to do a 1 degree of freedom thing. He's like, no, I'm serious. If you can put it in a steering wheel, I can make it work with Need for Speed. So you could actually feel the centripetal forces in the wheel as you go through turns. And if you're driving on cobblestone, you feel the shakes. If you go airborne, the wheel would get loose because the tires are no longer in contact with the road. You can make it feel like you're driving on snow. I could do all kinds of really cool things. So I said, okay, that's pretty cool. So we put it in a steering wheel, and the E3 show, which is the biggest trade show where the new gaming products are typically announced, and the retailers like Best Buy and GameStop are there to put their orders in for the Christmas season. We showed this steering wheel at the E3 show, and it looked kind of like this setup. It was in a cockpit. We put the technology with the robotics and the motor. It was embedded in the console, attached to the steering wheel, and you could sit there and play Need for Speed. And we had this really big aha moment at the trade show, and it came when people were coming to play Need for Speed, and some of the people that were coming to play this game actually worked for EA on the Need for Speed team, and they were like the quality assurance testers. So they had literally played this for hours and hundreds of hours looking for bugs and such. And because they had done that, they had memorized their personal best lap times on like every single track. And so when they were playing this, they said, wow, this is really fun, this is cool, I can feel the cobblestone, when I bump another car, I can feel it. But the other thing they noticed, which they got really excited about, was when they finished a race, they said, wow, I beat my personal lap time. On Laguna Seca, I never get this time, but this is 3 seconds faster than what I ever got. And it turned out that they were actually able to drive faster with this force feedback or haptic technology than without, because steering wheels at the time were these plastic toys with a bungee cord on the inside, so that if you turn the steering wheel and let go, the bungee cord would make it snap back to center. And it would do that whether the steering wheel was even plugged in or not, right? So it felt the same whether you're going 5 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour through a turn or straightaway or whatever. But now with this technology, because Chuck Walters had the physics in there and it was accurately modeled, so you felt the proper forces. For those of you that have done what I've accidentally done sometimes and taken an off-ramp off a freeway a little bit too fast, you may have experienced that the steering wheel, you'll start to feel a little sort of, it gets a little squirrely. And basically what that's telling you is your tires are hanging on for dear life. And you're just at the point where they're going to break free and you're going to fishtail, the back end's going to kick out and you'll lose control. But because you feel that little bit of squirreliness, it's actually the edges of your tires sitting on the road, and it has a certain contact patch. This is getting too technical, but the edges of the contact patch break free first before the whole thing does. And so that's what's giving those little squirrely things. And so Chuck had put that in the game. And in real life, when you feel that, you can either back off the gas or ease off the turn to recover before you flail out, right? So that was what was helping these players when they were playing. They could go right up to the absolute limit through the turn Whereas before, they had to kind of keep enough safety margin that they wouldn't spin out, because there was no cue. Like visually, if you see you're starting to lose it, you've already spun out. So anyway, that was our big aha moment. It was like, wow, that's what people would be willing to pay for. Whoops, gosh, why do I keep on? Yeah, and so we sold to these 3 people, and they had $1 million each, and so winning, the thing that was really, really valuable. So gamers like cool and interactive and fun, but if you can guarantee that they'll win, not only will they buy, but they'll pay way, way, way more for that than just the cool and fun. Because like, what's the first thing you do, whether you're playing Call of Duty or a racing game or anything else? You're looking to see how many frags did I have, and how many did my friend have on me? Did I beat him in lap time? What's my score? And so basically, all else being equal, if you had a force feedback steering wheel with this centripetal forces in it, you were going to beat your friend every time, all else being equal. And so that was who we decided to go after, driving game enthusiasts, and we could promise them winning. And these wheels that formerly were like $100 for the plastic one with the bungee cord, Logitech was actually able to sell these for like $300, which was pretty cool. So kind of fast forwarding a little bit, we had to figure out things like, oh, nobody will buy from this small company of 6 people that were in grad school 6 months ago, but they will trust Logitech, and so we had to negotiate with different parties. But basically, for the $300 wheel that Logitech sold to Best Buy, for instance, they sold it to Best Buy for $200. Best Buy would end up selling it to consumers for $300. We'd get a 5% royalty, so we'd only get a 10% cut of each one. But in return for that, now Logitech, all the products could be on shelves at Best Buy and elsewhere. So we finally had a business model, and we started to have some revenue, which is great. But there are a couple things I want to highlight, and believe it or not, this translates over to other realms, like even in higher ed. So this almost didn't happen, because what we learned was that we needed games like Need for Speed, as well as F1 racing and NASCAR racing, all to put the technology in. So there was a programmer at all these gaming companies that had to make it work with the steering wheel, otherwise it wouldn't do anything. The motor wouldn't know what to do. And fortunately, we had people like Chuck Walters, who was pretty well known in the community. They're kind of a fraternity of people that make driving games. He was telling his friends, like, yeah, you definitely should put this in. It was really easy. I can show you how. So great, that was helpful. We had Logitech, who wanted to sell the product, and they were pushing all the game companies, yeah, it'll work with our wheel. You'll do really well. You'll win these awards because it'll be a better game. And so we thought we were in really good shape until all the way up through the producer and even the product manager, who had the final say about what to put in the product, and even to, well, anyway, so we thought we were good until 11th hour, suddenly we learned that EA wasn't going to put it into the game. And so if it wasn't a Need for Speed, that was going to be a disaster. You'd have a steering wheel that basically was a big paperweight, because unless the game worked with it, it doesn't do anything. And the person who was against it was the VP of Sales of Electronic Arts. And one of the things that we learned about was, regardless of what you're talking about, it could be haptic feedback, force feedback, better graphics, or whatever else, all he cared about was hitting his sales numbers for the holiday Christmas buying season. And he said, our products, we sell over half of all our games that we sell, half of all games that we sell in an entire year are sold during that Christmas buying season. So our products must be on the shelf by October. That's when the Christmas buying season starts. So our products had to be on the shelves by October. And now you're telling me this was I think in June or July. And they said, now the game's done. If we make changes to it, we have to run it through all our QA testing to make sure it doesn't introduce any other bugs. It's going to crash. And so that's going to slow everything down. And we may not be able to have the game in stores by October by adding, doesn't matter what it is, adding anything at this point. It's like, no way, I'm not doing it. I'm not jeopardizing sales. So suddenly what we thought was going to be fantastic wasn't going to happen. And Logitech stepped in and brokered this deal. And they said to the VP of Sales, look, how many do you think you're going to sell in the first 2 weeks of October? So we will put some extra testers on it to get the testing done. So ideally, you're not even going to miss your extra window. But we will buy whatever you think you would normally sell in a couple weeks. We'll buy all those units from you now. So we're going to pay up front, because we want to bundle them with the wheel. So when people buy the wheel, they don't have to buy the game separately. We'll just put in the wheel. In fact, we'll buy twice that much. So you're not going to miss your shipping date because we're going to give you the extra engineers to finish the testing really quickly. And even if you did miss a week or two, we're buying twice as much as you would normally sell in those couple weeks, or something to that effect. And so suddenly the deal was consummated and things were great. But the key point I wanted to make here is this is true everywhere, that even when everything looks rosy and everybody wants it, there may be something that you don't anticipate that is the critical roadblock, and it has nothing to do with how great your technology or your idea or whatever it is that you're doing is. There's some overriding factor that you weren't aware of that's a higher priority to somebody at a really senior decision level. So that got us going in the gaming industry, but I want to just really quickly touch on a couple other industries that we got into. So the video games was our first market. We got into medical simulation. Does anybody have an idea why an orange might be relevant to medical simulation? Yeah?
Whenever you do a surgical technique, you start with a fruit or an orange, you use stitching.
Yeah. So believe it or not, this is true of most medical students around the country. They learn certain procedures, whether it's surgical procedures, cutting, or needle insertion procedures, practicing on fruit, animals, cadavers, different kinds of things. But the orange in particular is what a lot of nurses, even med students, what they practice on for starting IVs, because the amount of force for a needle to break through the peel of an orange is about the same amount of force for it to break through your skin. And so I'm not exaggerating that much when I say, okay, stick this needle in an orange like 20 or 30 times, and then once you're done, go start an IV for this patient next door. And that's why a lot of times you'll get the hematomas, the big ugly purple bruising, because they miss the vein or whatever else. And it's not life-threatening, it's just very painful and not very pleasant. But so we applied our haptic technology to this problem as well. So it's kind of a low-res picture, but this is actually a syringe, and this was how do you start an IV? So as you move that syringe around on the screen, you would see the syringe moving on the screen, and as you, just like the earlier example of the dashboard, as the catheter approached the patient's skin, the moment it touched the skin, the motors inside would start to offer this resistance, and you would push harder, and you'd start to see the skin indent from the needle point, and then you keep pushing harder, and you get to a point where it actually breaks through the skin, and for the simulator, the motors would just turn off the force, so suddenly you'd break through, and then they turn on again because you'd start to feel resistance, which is, if you did it right, the resistance of the needle as it's pushing against the venal wall, the wall of the vein. And then you keep pushing harder until you feel a second pop, and that's the needle breaking through the wall of the vein, and now the needle is right where it needs to be. It's inside the vein. Hopefully you don't feel a third pop, which means you went through the back wall of the vein, you went too far. And then in our simulator, the person would say, ow! And we even had a pediatric version where the baby's crying the whole time as you're trying to start an IV. But so we had this line of medical products for medical simulators. And there are other procedures too where touch was equally important, whether it's endoscopy or colonoscopies. That's actually a faceplate, so you can see there's an endoscope going into the nose of the faceplate there, and that's what endoscopy normally looks like on a screen, and they can actually feel the resistance as they're trying to snake the endoscope down towards your stomach. So we had a line of products for that, as well as even for laparoscopy. And it was a pretty successful line of products, although I will say as a quick aside that one of the things we didn't anticipate was we didn't really understand ultimately who would be buying these and who would make the buying decisions for it. Because while of course you'd think a doctor to have tried these procedures on simulators and gotten essentially like it down perfectly before they practice on a patient, there's no real incentive to require that, because that just adds more training time for the doctors. Like with the IV, there's no downside to you missing the vein in a patient a few times. So the economic benefit for the economic cost wasn't always to the point where the person ultimately making the buying decision said, oh, we must have this. It ended up being that for things like this IV simulator, some Harvard Med School will buy some because they want to kind of show prospective students and so on that we've got the coolest and greatest technology. We're really an advanced med school, but it wasn't an integral part of their training. And that's getting into probably more detail than I need to, except that sometimes what seems like, why wouldn't everybody want this? Again, there's somebody else who's prioritizing decisions based on something else. So eventually we sold that business to CAE. If you don't know CAE, they're the ones that train pretty much all airline pilots, whether Delta, United, American, Lufthansa. They all train in these essentially motion simulators. They look very similar to what you find at the amusement parks, except these feel exactly what it's like to fly a plane. So just to give you an idea, like if you are a pilot for, I don't know, American, and you've flown, say, Airbuses most of your career, and suddenly you're going to be flying a Boeing 777, you would go train on this Boeing 777, and after you get signed off on the Boeing 777, because everything looks, sounds, and feels like the real thing, the next time you're flying a real Boeing 777 with real passengers in the bag. So that's how lifelike it is. And then if anybody's been to Epcot Center and flown Mission Space, it's a pretty old ride now, but if you remember, there's a joystick that you grab a hold of, and Gary Sinise talks to you, you better take control of the ship. We're going through this minefield or asteroid field. We put the technology in the joystick so you could feel the collisions with the asteroids. And then today, I mentioned this earlier, there have been 3 billion phones to date that have shipped with the smart vibrotactile, not just dumb buzzing on and off, but actually feels like button clicks. So we actually measured the frequency and vibration of what different button clicks feel like for a MacBook Air button press versus a ThinkPad versus different kinds of buttons and what kinds of feel do people prefer in their buttons. And so we programmed that to try to replicate that as closely as possible. So even though you're just touching a large piece of glass, it vibrates in a way that makes it feel like a click. So that today is about a $25 million revenue stream for the company. Immersion gaming is about a $10 million revenue stream. So kind of wanted to come back to our topic, our theme. So what does that have to do with entrepreneurship? So the key point I want to make, back in 1989, right before I went over to Stanford, if you were interested in haptics, if that's like what you're passionate about, you wanted to work in haptics, really only had two choices. There was a very, very small handful of schools, Stanford and MIT being two of them, maybe Northwestern, maybe a couple others, but very, very small handful of schools that had faculty members doing research in haptics. So you could go and be a PhD student there, or maybe a postdoc, maybe hope to get a faculty position kind of in that field, but pretty limited, very competitive. And the only people with the resources and interest in pursuing this were the people doing like the airplane simulators and Department of Defense. That was it. And 10 years after Immersion launched, and it's not solely because of Immersion, but there are other companies that entered the fray as well, but it advanced this area from what was primarily a research area to a whole stream of products from a lot of different companies. And if any of you have like the Force Touch trackpad or your Apple Watch with the little Haptic engine, that's essentially the same flavor of technology. So, so it very much was an alternative career path in that it was a way to kind of create a career around something you might be interested in that didn't necessarily exist as a career today. And just because it doesn't exist today doesn't mean that it can't be a very fulfilling, and not only fulfilling, but also an opportunity that provides you experiences that there's no way you'd get in like a conventional large organization. I mean, I was, 2 years out of my PhD program, and here I was in Steve Jobs' office in a meeting that went terribly, but nonetheless, in a meeting with Steve Jobs showing our technology. If I had gone to whoever the big leading tech companies were at the time, whether it was HP or whoever else, there's no way. I would have been coming in at entry level, I would have been doing things and kind of confined to the lab. And so not only can you create your own career, but it can be a lot more rewarding. Especially if you're right out of school, the risk is a lot. It's not really that much riskier compared to, say, later on if you've got a mortgage and you're sending multiple kids to college or whatever. Well, that might be a lot more risky. Although, if you're in Silicon Valley, it's like a badge of courage. If you're with a startup company that goes under, you quickly get hired by other people. They want people with startup experience. So it's not even necessarily that much riskier. But I was essentially what I'd kind of describe as a latent entrepreneur in that I didn't know what entrepreneurship was. My parents weren't entrepreneurs. They didn't tell me about it. I kind of grew up thinking government is the way to go. It's security. It's all that kind of stuff. And once I was introduced to people who were starting companies, obviously Stanford and Silicon Valley's got that in the air and the culture and the water. I was like, oh, this is really cool, and I found an opportunity. So back in '89 and even more recently, I think there are a lot of latent entrepreneurs where they either just haven't had the exposure or the opportunity to, or even the understanding of what it is, but if they got introduced to it, they might find that this is exactly what I'd like to do. But then I think we're at a stage where it's gone beyond that. It's no longer this alternative career for just latent entrepreneurs, because some of you may be sitting there and saying, oh, that's a pretty cool story, but I'm not sure that I would want to be an entrepreneur. I'm pretty sure I'm not a latent entrepreneur either, because now you've told me about it and I'm still not excited. But even just for just even for argument's sake, if I were interested, how do I even learn these skills? How do I learn to be an innovator or entrepreneur? Because I haven't gotten any of this in my schooling to date. I'm taking, we're talking about at lunch, statics and thermodynamics. How's that going to help me be an innovator and entrepreneur? So today, and this is kind of what the topic was going to be, is it's becoming sort of this de facto career, in that it's not necessarily an alternative. In fact, you might even think it's something that should be part of everybody's thinking in their education, because it really prepares you for any place you want to go. I had a video here, but I'm going to skip it and just I'll tell you about the video while I leave this quote up from Tom Friedman's editorial in the New York Times a few years ago. So the video was for these couple students at University of Maryland. We like to highlight them. They started this company called Food Recovery Network. And they came in as, one was an environmental science major, one was a government politics major. Neither of them had any notion of being an entrepreneur, starting a company or anything like that. Wasn't really, they were the ones that were saying, I'm not even sure I'm a latent entrepreneur. But they, like a lot of campuses, noticed how much food was being thrown away from the cafeterias on campus at the end of the day. And like, that's crazy, that's so much food, and that's just this one cafeteria. We've got multiple dining halls. And so they started looking into how could we get this food delivered to food shelters in DC that need it. And what they quickly ran into is what a lot of people have run into on different campuses. It's easy to get a few people like excited, oh, I'll help out with that. And so you have some initial steam, you deliver a few dozen meals maybe, but what happens after a few days or a few weeks or a few months? Your volunteers start disappearing. They have to worry, oh, I'm going to fail my class, I need to go back doing so-and-so. And they started to realize we need a more creative way of addressing this problem, because just relying on volunteers and whatever else, this isn't sustainable. We need a way of not only solving this efficiently, but also scaling it. So they did figure out a great way of delivering hundreds of meals on campus, but then they also wanted to say, hey, other schools can do this too. Can we have a sort of a startup toolkit for recovering food at your campus? So here's everything you need. An instruction manual, guidelines, and materials so other people can get started. How are we going to pay for that? And before they knew it, they were immersed in the world of innovation and entrepreneurship. They probably wouldn't have called it that. It's just they came across something that they're really passionate about and they got excited to work on. And they had a lot of resources on campus, just like at many other schools, where they could go get help from people who had either started companies or started nonprofits and that kind of thing before. And so this kind of goes to, regardless of what you think you're going to study, these innovation and entrepreneurship skills are what employers are looking for, or you can create your own opportunities like we talked about. And so entrepreneurship is sort of always talked about as starting companies, and that certainly is one possible outcome. But if you think about it more as how do you maximize the impact, the number of people you help and the impact that you have. And that can be at a small company, it can be at a large company, it could be at a nonprofit or foundation, it can be in government, it can be anywhere else. And if you think about it more broadly in that context, then it really is a skill that everybody should have, right? And so, again, we were talking about this sort of at lunch, but a lot of people have different definitions of innovation and different definitions of entrepreneurship, and there's no right or wrong, but the way at Maryland we like to think of it is innovation is how to creatively solve these really tough challenges. And then entrepreneurship is, once you figured out that solution for, wow, these 10 people are really benefiting, they're delighted. Well, how many more sets of 10 people are there elsewhere? How do you find them? How do you get the same solution out to other people? So how do you maximize your impact? And that's the entrepreneurship. And there are ways of teaching both. The design thinking and lean startup, some people call it different names. Some people teach essentially the same concepts or similar concepts or parts of it and call it different things. But basically there are methodologies for teaching creatively solving problems and scaling the solutions to maximize impact. I'm going to kind of skip ahead in the interest of time here to say, let me jump ahead. All right. So, all right. Okay, so there are ways of teaching innovation and entrepreneurship. Let me jump ahead, actually, this one. And what's interesting, what's going on today, which is kind of where I wanted to end the talk, is that, and kind of get thoughts and perspective and any other input, is that these skills, these innovation and entrepreneurship skills, specifically things like design thinking and lean startup, are actually showing up more and more in job descriptions from companies that you would think have nothing to do with entrepreneurship. So I highlighted 3 organizations here, and this is just tip of the iceberg, but Capital One has something called Capital One Labs. And they've got a separate facility, and they specifically are hiring people with expertise in design thinking and lean startup because they want to completely reimagine the way people interact with their money and their finances and forget completely ATMs and everything how we do things today, just like clean slate. And so they have a really big organization that does that now, or growing number of people. It's a few dozen people now. Same thing with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and even the U.S. Department of Justice, if you can believe that. They also have programs that are combining design thinking and lean startup to try to solve big problems that they're facing. Health and Human Services, some of them are how to improve healthcare at Native American reservations. Some of them are how to more rapidly react to opioid overdoses like heroin, things like that. So they're applying these same techniques to the challenges that they're facing. And U.S. Department of Justice, same thing. So regardless of what you think you're going to do when you finish your PhD program, you might be thinking, I'm going to stay in academia. You might be thinking I might go to industry, small company, large company. I might be going nonprofit or government. There are plenty of opportunities out there, and you can set yourself apart and be better prepared to make a contribution immediately, maximize impact by learning these design thinking and lean startup skills. Not to mention that there are a growing number of schools, Arizona State being certainly one of them, the leading ones in Maryland, but growing number of schools who are really embracing this design thinking and lean startup and embedding it in programs all over, not having it just as an elective or even as an extracurricular activity, but embedding it in your core program. So that was the genesis for this thinking that, now in the 21st century, innovation entrepreneurship is really kind of the de facto career instead of the alternate career. And I'd be happy to stick around and invite debate if anybody feels violently differently. Or any comments or thoughts or insights. But yeah.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you for coming. Quick question. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how students might go about the intellectual property protection route, what you do first, when you do it. I know it's a chicken and egg question. We've got a product, but we need IP around it. When do we release it? What's too soon? When's too late?
Yeah. It's funny. We were just talking about this a little bit earlier of those topics do come up and there's a time and place for it. And because sometimes at one level it goes counter a little bit to this idea of collaboration, but yet you also want to make sure that, and we went through this ourselves in our startup where Microsoft tried to steal our technology and we had to have it patented and so on. So I don't have a perfect answer by any means. But I think what I've seen at Maryland, at ASU, at other schools is particularly for student classes that the IP is owned by the students, and there are varying levels of support, sometimes from free legal clinics to classes to a law firm that's doing pro bono work that comes on campus once in a while to advise on those kind of matters. But the university is generally pretty good about saying, students, you own this. We're not going to try to do that. Unless the work has been funded by somebody else. And if it's been funded by National Science Foundation or a corporate sponsor or something like that, generally as a condition of them paying for that work, they're going to have rights to it. And I don't know. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but there's definitely a distinction, it seems like, between the students and what's research oriented.
No, it's good. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll come to you next.
A lot of our students aren't just out of their undergrad or master's degrees. They've worked for 10, 20 years.
Mhm.
Some of them had their own businesses and run their own companies. I'm curious about your transition and your experience. You've been in academia for 9 years now.
Yeah.
You said? So can you talk to them maybe about your transition into academia and what that was like and how that was
Yeah.
different from your previous?
Yeah, thank you. And
Some of them are dealing with that right now. What's going on?
so that was an important point I didn't make here, which I think is interesting. So I kind of told you how I think it used to be that it was more of an alternative career path. But the skills I gained, the startup I was with, and by the way, the startup I was with was particularly helpful for me because we had, I think, 3 out of our first 7 employees were from IDEO, which is a design firm totally immersed in design thinking. So I learned some of that through those people. And then plus our first board member was Steve Blank, who's like Mr. Lean Startup. So I learned a lot of those skills that were helpful in the business world in the video game industry and medical simulation, whatever. But what I found when I went to work at University of Maryland, where I initially was working with people to help them start companies, but now we're not focused on starting companies. That's only a small piece, a possible outcome. We want to teach design thinking and lean startup. Those same design thinking and lean startup skills are applicable wherever you run, because higher ed is one of the most complicated, you guys know this, right? It's one of the most complicated and sometimes like non-intuitive things to navigate for why shouldn't we do this? Everybody thinks it's a great idea, and you just don't understand why somebody somewhere higher up or whatever doesn't improve it. And design thinking and lean startup, they don't guarantee you're going to succeed, but they definitely give you some tools and some ways that you're going to have a better shot at either being successful or at least understanding what those other things were, like I talked about earlier, where there was somebody who cared more about hitting the holiday shopping season or whatever else. So, so for me, it was really eye-opening that what I thought was only applicable in the startup world and in industry actually is every bit, if not even more useful in higher ed. And therefore, if it works in higher ed, it can work anywhere, right? I mean, it can work in government and so on. So I don't know if that's exactly responsive to your question, but I think those tools and methods and mindsets, it's just especially valuable while you're here. Take advantage of them and try some initiatives here in this higher ed setting, because there's some fantastic learning opportunities here that'll make it a piece of cake once you're out of here, So, Micah.
So building on that, I'm curious about your personal journey of like going from being a startup to go, oh, well, I personally want to go work in academia, and I guess also like work-life balance types of issues. Like I'm imagining those people that you first sold stuff to for $1 million each also are your children.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So work-life balance. So, and this varies for everybody, right? Everybody's got different situations, and I'll be the first to tell you that I wouldn't do what I did then again now that I've got the 3 kids and mortgage or whatever else. But I don't necessarily look at it, because I can't, well, let me describe it a different way. So the best situation you can possibly be in, and hopefully a lot of you are already in this situation. I know some of my colleagues talking to you are in this case where you're doing something that you're really excited about, and the fact that you might get paid for it as well is just like icing on the cake, and so you just couldn't be happier. And if you're fortunate enough to be in that kind of situation, it just makes everything else a lot easier. And so when I was in the startup, like people's like, oh, startup's so hard. They work 80 or 100 hours a week and so on. And yeah, we did for a couple years, maybe 3, 4 years in that. But I don't look at it that way. It's because if you're somebody, like think back to when you were in your mid-20s or whatever else. So I wasn't married, didn't have kids, didn't have mortgage. What would I want to do? I'd want to hang out with people my friends, and do something that we're all excited about. So on weekends, I'd want to hang out with my friends, working on something, or doing something that we're all excited about. It just so happened that building that crazy contraption that nobody bought was the thing that we thought was really fun. And so rather than going out to a bar or whatever else, I mean, that was what we enjoyed doing. And then if you tally it up, like, wow, that was 80 or 100 hours last week, but we didn't think of it that way. So it doesn't exactly answer Mike's question, but if you're lucky enough to be in that situation, then it's not, you don't view it as work. And then if the family and work-life balance thing, right now, I mean, I feel like in a university environment, that's one of the benefits of being in higher ed, is that though it's fraught with challenges and complexity, it's also pretty family friendly. So again, while you're here, take advantage of that sort of family friendly setting to explore and try a lot of these things that you may not have as much of an opportunity to do so once you leave. So, all right, maybe a last one here, and then I'm happy to hang out afterwards if there was anybody that wanted to chat some more, but okay, yeah.
I just was wondering, from all the talks I've been to on innovation and entrepreneurship and such of that matter, I've heard all of these stories of how they sort of made their path on entrepreneurship, but it's always seemed that you immerse yourself in something you're passionate in, and then you kind of just find yourself in a position, a career position where you're a PI, you're a lead designer, you're something like that, but I've never really heard how they find themselves there. And if they talk to someone and say, hey, I'm worth it, can I maybe have a position or something like that? How does that work out?
So there's this paradox, which is probably it might be the one most challenging thing about an entrepreneurial path, in that on one hand, like you just said, and like I said, that if you find something that you're really passionate about, then that's great, because you find other people that are interested in it, you're putting all your time into it, and it's fantastic. And you don't get easily discouraged by, like, I need to give up or doing something else. But that's a double-edged sword, because that same passion you have for your project also makes you completely deaf to what other people are telling you when they say, this won't work, or this is my big problem hitting the holiday shopping season, or something like that. So part of the trick, I think, for everybody is, if you remain deaf to what the world is telling you of how they prioritize things and how they make their decisions, you're going to end up bankrupt pretty quickly, and you're going to have to go do something else that you may not be as psyched about. But if you can kind of hit that balance of, this is still in that sweet spot of what I'm really passionate about, and I'm understanding how people make decisions and what they're willing to pay for and what they're not, then eventually you hope things line up to say, oh, there's alignment here between what this person feels is important and what I can contribute here, and sort of create that opportunity. And that's very different than the traditional job search, where you blanket send out your resumes to everybody and hope somebody responds to you. It's more that you're seeing what matches best with what you're doing, and there's nobody else that can compete with you if that's the case, because you've uniquely found this thing that you're one of a small handful of people in the world that's really excited and passionate about working on this thing, and you found this unique alignment with somebody that where you can help them in a way that nobody else can. So you don't have to go through this hope they will see it kind of thing, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Right. Cool. I think we're right at time. So thanks for coming over. I'm happy to connect anybody or talk with anybody. My contact info is at innovation.umd.edu. You can click down to the picture of me playing the piano, and love to hear what you guys end up and what you end up doing. All right, thanks.
So thanks again for coming. We'll be around to answer a couple questions one-on-one, and then